Yo, what's up guys? Marcus here. I am gonna show you how to tune the GTX 960M for Titanfall 2. Now this is an extremely difficult game for me to tune the GTX 960M, and I'll show you why later on here, and how some of the settings are different from what I am used to. Unfortunately, I got very few footage to show you about online multiplayer gameplay because there is a lot of problems with the servers in logging on and actually playing online. If you don't want the long version of this test and tune, then skip to this timeline to get the final settings. But enough of that, let me head into the graphics menu and show you what the settings are. So for the static benchmarks, I found this nice little location in the first mission that uses the most GPU power. This game hardly uses much CPU power, it only uses about 25% CPU, so it's mostly a GPU intensive game. So this is the default settings that shows up every time you select restore recommended settings. Let me talk about this adaptive resolution FPS target. So what this is it's a very smart little program that dynamically changes the resolution of your screen. Although you can see the resolution on the top of the setting menu right there is set at 1080p. However, whatever your graphics card is rendering for resolution can be drastically different. So yeah, I mean, basically setting it to, let's say, 60 FPS right there in this settings means that your graphics card can produce much lesser resolution to hit that target of 60 FPS. So the good about this settings right here is setting 60 FPS for most people would be the easiest thing to do, just because it is so much easier to just change the settings to 60 FPS rather than to tune every single component of your graphics card specifically. And the bad thing about it is, while it is really hard to get consistent benchmarks if you use these settings right here, and also if your graphics card is not powerful enough, you'll find that your resolution is actually extremely low. Here's an example of all these default settings in play here. With the adaptive resolution, you can see this on-screen resolution is extremely low. Frame rates will be 50, 51. Yeah, that's good, but let's turn that off and actually see what is the true 1080p resolution and frame rates that your GTX 960M is producing. Adaptive resolution off, this is the actual 1080p resolution that your GTX 960M is producing. You can notice the frame rates drop drastically. However, picture quality has drastically increased, giving you a much more crisp and sharp image on screen. The difficult thing about tuning a graphics card with adaptive resolution is you have no idea what resolution scaling percentage they're using. So on-screen resolution is 1080p, but what percentage reduction from the 1080p is your graphics card actually doing right now? Right. So as I say, that's hard to benchmark. But the good thing is the changes are so instantaneous throughout the gameplay here. If you for some reason drop below 60 FPS, the rendering resolution changes almost instantaneously without even you noticing the changes there. So that's a cool thing about it. The following test and tune will be done with the adaptive resolution turned off, so you can see the raw performance of the GTX 960M. Get on with the tuning part of this graphics card here. First setting I change is the texture quality to low here, and once you get back into game, you can see the FPS gain is actually about 2 frames per second. Later on I will show you at a lower resolution, actually the FPS difference is closer to 5 FPS, but in 1080p it's 2 FPS. After many hours of tuning, I know exactly where to go in the menu to show you the components that give you the best FPS improvements. Next up is a big one. It's called the ambient occlusion. Just disable that, and you will notice in the game you would have a 5 FPS gain for the graphics, which is pretty significant. And the GTX 960M has always been a little bit weak when it comes to ambient occlusion. Next up, get into the sun shadow detail and set that to disable. This is also a big one because it will give you a 5 FPS gain. Last but not least, you want to change the spot shadow detail from low to high. Doesn't give you FPS, actually reduces your FPS by 1. And just stick it at high so you get a little bit better image quality. I think this one has a very high setting as well, but that actually reduces a lot of FPS. So keep it at high so it gives you a slight boost in image quality with very little frame rates taken up. Notice how I skipped quite a few different components there, but they only change very little FPS. Things like anti-aliasing only changes 1 to 2 FPS, anti-strophic only changing it to about 2 FPS if you change that to binary. Model effects, impact, and ragdolls, changing all 4 of them to low only changes about 2 frames per second as well. So keep that the way it is. So you can see 27 FPS previously without changing all these settings compared to 38 FPS. That's a pretty good increase in performance at 1080p, but it's not gonna give you a 60 frames per second gameplay with these settings. But I'm gonna show you how to do 60 frames per second. Before I get there, I'm going to show you how to get closer to that 60 FPS. So what you can see on screen here is this is the next benchmark that is going to be done exactly the same settings, but the resolution on screen will be at 1600 times 900, or also known as 900p resolution. As you can see, big boost in frame rates going up to 51 or 52 frames per second. You got yourself 13 or 14 frames per second doing that. Makes the game much more pleasant and gameable. And as you can see, looking elsewhere in the map, sometimes give it about 60 plus or higher frame rates. Those settings I mentioned before is great for higher FPS gameplay. However, the result of that will be the image on the left here, where BT looks like it's been painted by a 5-year-old. Whereas the new settings I'm going to recommend you is the BT on the right. Now, other than the Titan paint job that's different, you'll notice also the rock formation just behind the Titan on the left side there. It's also much higher definition. Seems like the image is popping out at you. Very sharp image quality. There's also a lot of different small changes, but you have to look closely at the images and then you can compare them and you can see there's a lot more things like the background seems sharper. It's just in general a much better image quality. Now to get that, you have to sacrifice about 5 frames per second in 900p resolution. The only settings to change is your texture qualities changed from low to medium. Now I mentioned earlier on in the 1080p that's a 2 frames per second difference. In 900p that's a 5 frames per second difference between the low or medium settings. But I think you can definitely appreciate the big difference in image quality there. Plus, this is a 2GB version of the GTX 960M. And putting it at medium settings at 900p would be about 1700 megabytes of VRAM usage. So it's still well within the limits there. You do not want to exceed 1800 megabytes, although you have 2 gigabytes. But after past 1800 megabytes, in most games I noticed there will be some sort of frame rate drop, which is very sporadic because of VRAM usage. So congratulations guys, thank you for staying with me for like a good 8.5 minutes on this video here. I know it's long, it's just really hard to tune this card, and I spent probably close to 8 hours tuning it yesterday. Anyway, so here is my final recommendation here. So play with this those settings that I mentioned about, and if you find that maybe the frame rate is not just high enough, because sometimes it do fall to about 40 or 45 frames per second on really intense fight scenes there. My last recommendation is go back to resolution, adaptive resolution, and change that to 60 FPS. So at this stage, since you optimize the graphics settings so much already, the resolution reduction is very minimal. I can notice it, but the changes is not drastic enough. And actually, this is the settings I do keep. Is with the adaptive resolution at 60. Let me show you some gameplay with the adaptive resolution at 60 and also the texture settings to medium. Enjoy!
Captain, we could use some help. Where do you think you're going, Outlaw? Be tightened down. All right, get a few shots in. Let's make this even. Be tightened down.
Well, that's all I have for you guys, and congratulations again in getting out the most, well, the absolute most out of your GTX 960M. I think this thing took me 6 to 8 hours of tuning. I can't remember, I lost track of time. But anyway, smash the like button here if you find this really helpful, and you know, if you have any questions, put it down in the comments below. I'll do my best to respond as soon as possible. And most of all, enjoy playing TitanFall 2. By the way, I love the single player campaign storyline. Freaking epic and awesome.